hit you like a brick wall. Because it doesn't come gently, right? Hopelessness comes hard, and it hits hard. I've been there lots. So I know how valuable hope is. But here's the thing about hope. As much as we know that we need it, it also can produce some pretty significant pain. Does it not? Because hope's about the future. And so when things maybe don't turn out the way we had anticipated, and we put a lot of hope there, right? You've been there too, right? It doesn't feel very good. And yet, I don't want to live without it. And our story today, we've gone from chapter 1, where it was just a hopeless situation, into chapter 2, where the narrator just masterfully kind of alters things. Not just a little bit. By the end of the chapter, we'll find that things have completely flipped, even in the language he uses in the text. And so here's where we've been so far in Ruth. So Ruth, if you're not familiar with the story, Ruth starts out with tragedy. I mean, like the worst nightmare possible. There's famine, and so Naomi and Elimelech, her husband, and their two sons move to Moab. They move away from the promised land, the land that God gave and promised to bless. They moved away from that, out of that, into Moab, which for a reader maybe from the Middle East, or especially from Israel, Moabites were kind of the lowest of the low. If you read through Genesis, the Moabites are the descendants of Lot and came about by incest. And so it's just kind of one of those like, what? And so I know there's younger kids in here, so you might have to explain some things at the end of this, which is okay, it's part of what a parent does, right? No apology, no. But anyway, they weren't very, people didn't, of that entire area, not just Israel, didn't hold them up very well, right? Or very highly. And so we have Ruth, and it's interesting how the narrator says Ruth the Moabite numerous times throughout the story. And so in this tragic beginning, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, dies. Her two sons married Moabite women. They both die. And in those days, that's a desperate situation. And so what we find is Naomi without a family. And we'll talk about family and how important that it was and is a little bit later in the message. But she hears that there's food back in Israel, in the Promised Land. And so she heads back with her two daughter-in-laws. One turns back, but Ruth refuses and says, no, where you're going, I'm going, your God will be my God. And so we have this confession of faith on the part of Ruth the Moabite. So in chapter 1, Naomi returns to Bethlehem, which is a significant place. Most of us would recognize that name because of Christmas. And just a side note, Ruth isn't just its own little story in the Bible. Ruth is part of the bigger story that the Bible is telling and actually plays a really significant part in that story. But that's actually going to be the intro for next week. So I won't do it today. But she returns home to Bethlehem with Ruth. And what we have is Naomi. And the writer gives us this incredible image of this broken woman who is full of bitterness. And maybe a better way to describe her is she is not full, she's empty. And even changes her name to Mara, which means bitterness. Well, at the start of chapter 2, Ruth goes out to glean in the fields because they need food. They're going to starve. They don't have any other means of support. And in those days, the way God had set up his people was that there was to be the foreigner and the widow and the child, the fatherless. Did I get that? Foreigner, widow, fatherless, and poor were able to glean in the fields. And so after the harvest was finished, they could go into the fields and they could pick up what was left over. And that was meant to take care of people in need. And so this is what Ruth does. And so we are introduced in chapter 2 to a man named Boaz. And Boaz, Rob did a great job last week, shows great kindness to Ruth. And what we see, and I think what the writer is trying to display here in that first half of the chapter, is Boaz is the embodiment of God's heart for the foreigner, the widow, the fatherless, because Ruth is actually all three of those. She gave up her land, she lost her husband, and her father-in-law. And so she fits into all the categories, and she's a foreigner, right? So, and the chapter starts with this interesting language, and it's meant to be ironic. Because the characters don't know it, but what the narrator's doing, he's giving us a glimpse of something. And he uses the phrase, "and it happened," or "it just so happened," depending on which translation. And so what we find is, the irony in the story is that one of the main themes of this story is God's providence and how much he is involved in our everyday lives with decisions, relationships, like everything. And so that's one of the big themes that we can take away from Ruth. And so he uses this, it just so happened, as if it was a coincidence, right? But that becomes very clear that it wasn't. Now Boaz shows this great kindness, fulfills the requirements of the law that God wanted. Like his heart is displayed through the law for the foreigners, for the poor, for the people in need. And Boaz is just, he's the embodiment of that. This is what it looks like, but he's not motivated simply by, I have to obey the law, because there's something else we see in Boaz, which is, it's coming out of his character. He's not just trying to do the right thing. This is who he is. And it's really, the way the narrator's written it, it's really clear that he's doing, his motivation is genuine, and it's a genuine care for both Ruth and Naomi. And so we left off at verse 14, and so I'm just going to back up to Ruth chapter 2, verse 13. This is Ruth's response to Boaz's kindness, which has been amazing to her. And we're actually going to pick that up a little bit later. "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." Moving on to what we're going into today. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine and vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. In some translations, it'll say that she was full. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave the orders to his men. "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah, which I read is around 22 liters. That's pretty heavy. It's like, barley's pretty heavy. I'm a farm kid, so I'm thinking 22 liters of barley, that's pretty heavy. So this next verse is quite surprising, gives us a little picture into, maybe we thought that Ruth was super slender, but you decide. She carried it back to town. Wow. And her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave to her what was left over, for she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Some other translations might just say redeemers or kinsman redeemers. We'll explain that later. Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, which would be a span of a few months. And she lived with her mother-in-law. Now, before we get into what we want to get into today, just a couple of things from that, some of the words that were said in that text to kind of give us a context of what's going on. The beginning, in the first 13 verses, Boaz expresses concern for Ruth and tells her don't go to other people's fields, stay in mine. And there's this idea of protection. Naomi, again, does the same thing. Don't go to another field in case you are harmed. So what the writer is doing is giving us this picture of the state of the nation. And Ruth is directly after the book of Judges. And so the story itself takes place during the time of the Judges. We don't know which one, but it's during one of them. And things are not going well in Israel. Israel has drifted away from God. And if you read the book of Judges, it's one of the key verses is, "In those days there was no king, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes." And so we have anarchy going on, and there is no king. In fact, that's the way it ends. The book of Judges ends. Now, one of the things that we can that we see in Ruth, coming right after that statement in Judges, is this is what God is doing about everyone did what was right in his own eyes, and there was no king. God is showing his hand at work in bringing them a king, because eventually King David would come through the line of Ruth. Okay, so let's jump into our story here today. And there's a few themes that actually two major ones that I want to key in on. The first major one is God's kindness. I think that we're meant to see not just the kindness of a man, but God's kindness revealed in this text. And so we're introduced to this character named Boaz. And there are very few characters in the Bible that don't have dirt on them, right? I mean, look at the disciples in the New Testament. The Bible's very honest about how broken and fallen the people are in all of the thousands of years that the Bible spans. People have always been broken. People have always been in need of salvation. We've always need help. The human condition needs something other than a human solution. And we see that from beginning to end. And so there are a handful of characters, though, where there's no dirt, where the Bible presents them as, it seems like different, like doesn't seem to be any fault in them. And what we're supposed to take from that is that when there's a character like that, what's happening is something about God specifically is being revealed. And it's not that it wasn't true, the story or whatever. It's that this person is the embodiment of something about God. And so in our text today, Boaz is the embodiment of God's kindness and generosity. Meaning this is what it looks like in everyday life, God's kindness and generosity. And so that's why we see just this unbelievable kindness coming from this man. And so what is it? What is this God's kindness? It's reflected and revealed in Boaz. Well, first of all, and we hit this a little bit already, God's heart for the foreigner, widow, fatherless, poor is displayed in the above and beyond actions of Boaz. Right? So he's already been unbelievably kind. In fact, has gone beyond what the law requires in that first half of that chapter. But then it goes even further. And so he invites her to dinner, right? Says, come and eat with us. Eat with me and my workers. And so it's giving her provision and care for her immediate needs. She's been working. It's hard work. Gleaning is an unbelievably difficult, like just, I can just imagine how sore my back would be if I was like picking stuff up off the ground all day in the hot sun. I think it was hot there. And it's from sunup to sundown. So that's a lot of time. And then after you're done, so you can't see anymore, then that's when you thresh it out. So then there's more time. So this is hard work. And Boaz is, he's offered her water a few verses earlier. Now he's providing her a meal. This is way beyond anything in the law. But as if that wasn't enough, as if food and water wasn't enough, then he instructs his workers to allow Ruth to glean even among the sheaves. So normally, the poor people or whoever's coming in would come in after the harvesters had passed. And Boaz is going like, no, not for her. She can glean while we're harvesting, while we're actually, putting things in the stalks or stooks or whatever it was. And then, twice, we see him telling them to speak kindly to her. Like, don't rebuke her, don't reprimand her. It's the negative side of it, but in essence, he's going like, speak kindly to her. Don't treat her poorly. And then to intentionally take grain, or to pull out grain from the stooks and put it on the ground for her. I'm like, this is amazing. And so what the reader is supposed to get here is a picture of kindness that is extravagant beyond belief. Because this is not normal. In fact, we see Ruth's response, and we'll get to it in a second here, but it's like a disbelief. Like, what? What is going on here? This is not normal. And just a note, as we head further into God's kindness, the reader is not meant to read into these actions as romantic on the part of Boaz. See, we know there's a love story here. And for a modern reader like us, this idea that Boaz could love Ruth, but not in a romantic way, is hard for us to put into our brains. Because this is not the way our society works. This is not the way our culture works. It's not the way we grew up, or it's not what we see in the movies. Right? It's just the way we've been shaped. And so it's hard for us not to read into Boaz some ulterior motives here, that he's got this hot girl in his field that he's going to try to woo. Like that is not what's going on here. It actually takes away from what is trying to be communicated about the purity of God's motivation when it comes to generosity and kindness. Pure motivation. And it's not to say that, Boaz didn't notice her that way at all. Like, we don't know, but that's the reader. We're not supposed to read that into it. We're supposed to get a picture of kindness that is beyond belief. And we'll see that in the responses. So I think Psalm 36 gives us kind of this picture of the extravagance of God's steadfast love and kindness being shown in this chapter. And this is from verse 5 to 9. Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Your righteousness is like the mountains of God. Your judgments are like the great deep. Man and beast you save, O Lord. How precious is your steadfast love, Lord, O God. The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. So this is imagery that's used in the chapter we just read with Boaz's protection over her. They feast, Boaz giving her food. Right? They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light do we see light. And so I think this is, in the story of Ruth here, I'm willing to bet lots that there's the imagery that's coming out of this chapter is pulled from this psalm. This is what God's love looks like. And specifically in our story, the kindness and generosity of God's love. So what's Ruth's response? Now we got to go back before what we read to get her response to this kindness. And I think it's important for us to understand because it helps us to absorb, oh, this is shocking, this type of kindness. And so it starts with her falling on her face and bowing before Boaz. And this is simply an extreme act of gratitude, or an act of extreme gratitude. She is so overwhelmed by thankfulness. And it's this idea that she can't believe it. Like, this isn't normal. People don't do this, especially because she's a Moabite, that's why I explained where the Moabites came from, right? She's despised. Not is she just a foreigner, she's a Moabite. And then she even asks the questions, why have I found favor in your eyes? Like, she's confused. It's confused amazement is what it is. It's completely unexpected. She was just expecting because she must have known the law. It doesn't tell us how she found out that she's able to go glean. But she went, asked if she could get into the field and did. But the generosity that's being shown was not expected at all by Ruth. She's completely shocked. And then she says that you've taken notice of me, that you've seen me, and you've allowed me to do this, and you've given me water. Like, you're not just seeing me as a poor widow, but you're actually the concern goes beyond that, where you've actually cared for my immediate needs. Like, she must have needed water really badly. It was hot, right? And so it's a surprise. This is not normal. This is not how any nation would treat a foreigner, especially. And if you were a widow or an orphan, like, the mentality of the time is, well, it's because somebody did something bad and you're being punished by the gods, or in Israel by Yahweh. So somebody did something. And so to have a man like Boaz pour out generosity and kindness is shocking beyond belief. So that's Ruth's previous response. So what's Naomi's response, right? So this is part of our story today. Like, Naomi responds to this too. So she's incredibly bitter. Her response to all the circumstances that happened in chapter 1 is just like, God's against me. Like, if you read it, if you haven't read it, read it, because it's just like, oh man, I think we've all been there. We've all felt that. But she's saying it, and she's pouring that out. And so what happens in this chapter? Well, I would say that kindness awakens hope. We see something happen to Naomi. It starts off with, well, blessed is the man who took notice of you, who let you into his field and allowed you to glean. And so part of that is, there is still some good in Israel. There are still people who have God's heart, and it's displayed by how they care for the poor and the needy. And then she doubles down when she finds out it's Boaz, right? It's like, oh, Boaz, may he be blessed by the Lord. She doubles down and gets another blessing. Whose kindness has not forgotten the living or the dead. Now, I read quite a bit about this verse because there's a lot of, it's very difficult in the Hebrew to understand what's being said here, whether it's the Lord's kindness or Boaz's kindness. And the narrator has used an ambiguous term here. And so pretty much all of the different resources that I read through said the same thing, that the ambiguity is probably intentional. Because the answer is yes. Yes, Boaz, yes, that's God's kindness. And the living and the dead, again, this is getting ahead to another couple of laws that were in the Old Testament to help families survive tragedy. And we'll get to that in a minute. And then, finally, Naomi brings up another new theme, and it's the Redeemer. He is one of our Redeemers. And so what we see in Naomi, this kindness given by Boaz, starts with a generic person blessed, and then it's blessed by the Lord. May the Lord bless Boaz when she finds out it's a relative. And then comes Redeemer. And let's we'll get to the Redeemer in a second. Sorry, I got one more thing here. So kindness reverses the tragic themes of chapter 1. And so what we find in chapter 1 is emptiness. Naomi is empty. Her life has been emptied of joy, and in its place is bitterness. And what we have here, and the reason I said some translations say, like when we said that Ruth ate enough, they keep using the word full, because it's meant to show us that something different is happening. There's a reversal here, that it was empty in chapter 1, and there's a fullness in chapter 2. And then despair and bitterness, which is how chapter 1 ends, to hope and blessing, which is how chapter 2 ends. Right? So we have double blessing, bless this guy, bless Boaz, and then the idea of redemption. So now there's a new hope, because Naomi knows the importance of this idea of a kinsman or guardian redeemer, which is our next thing. So last thing we see is death to life. And so in chapter 1, death pervades it. Right? All three of the men in Naomi's family, death. We have the death of joy. We have the death of so many things. She has to say goodbye to her other daughter-in-law, who ends up going back to Moab. And in chapter 2, the reversal is hope. And it's in this theme of redemption. And so that's our next big theme, the hope of redemption, or even the hope that redemption brings. So Boaz was revealed to be a guardian or kinsman redeemer, and here's the significance of that. The law made provision for a family who went through tragedy to keep their land in their family line, and have their family name continue. And so it's actually two laws, two big ideas here. So the land could be redeemed for the deceased family by a close relative. Now, the line is a whole other deal. The line, or the family name, would continue through a relative marrying the widow and having children with her. The children of the woman would retain the father's name and inherit his land. Now, this is significant because those children belong to the dead man. So, in our case, we have Boaz, and I think Mahlon are the two men. Mahlon was Ruth's husband, who passed away, Elimelech's, Naomi's son. And we have Boaz, who's a close relative. So if Boaz is this possible, I won't give the story away, right? Spoiler alert. If Boaz is the possible redeemer, and he redeemed, and let's say he marries Ruth, Boaz's children through Ruth would not belong to him. They would belong to Mahlon. And that line would continue. And the land that belonged to Elimelech, Mahlon, would then belong to those children and not his other children. So we don't know if Boaz, we don't have no idea if Boaz already had a wife or already had kids. We have no clue here. But we do know what's going to happen. And we do know that this idea of redemption is really significant. And so the family name Like, this is really important to Naomi. Like, everything is lost. And so all of a sudden, this idea of redemption brings hope. Why is this important? The idea of a kinsman redeemer? Well, one of the things that we have to understand about this time is that salvation came to the poor, widow, fatherless, foreigner, and everyone else through inclusion into a family. It was so important. This is when the reader begins in chapter 1, and it's the death of her family, which puts her in a really difficult place of vulnerability. She no longer has a family. It's to give us this sense of, oh, her salvation, her safety, everything is lost. That's the emptiness that comes out of chapter 1. And so the inclusion in a family was representative of this salvation, that you had safety, protection, and your family name could continue. There was land, there was what you needed to live. And so the idea of that was so important. That's why this idea of kinsman redeemers, super important. Without family, there was no salvation. Interestingly enough, salvation still comes in the form of inclusion into a family, does it not? Is that not like language scattered throughout the New Testament, the family of God? In fact, we just sang, you're no longer a slave. We're sons and daughters of God. Like, we're children of God. That's inclusion into a family. So it didn't end in the olden times. This is still what we need. It's why the church isn't just a whole bunch of individuals trying to follow a God, but it is together, it is family, because that's where salvation lies, in the relationships, the safety, all the provision, all of those things that a family brings. That's the imagery that's meant to be evoked when it talks about the family of God. This is why God places such importance on family. Family is so important from beginning to end in the scripture. There's tons of emphasis on family and how significant and close to God's heart it is. And he's even built salvation around family. God is a father, us as his children. And all of the promises about inheritance and all the things follow those family, that family idea of family. Okay, we need to move on. You guys get it. What's our takeaways from this story, right? There's some really cool themes in here, some really strong, powerful language. God's kindness for me is just like, in fact, my prayer going into this is, Lord, I want to be able to at least get a little bit of your kindness kind of displayed. Like, can you show it to us? Because my words aren't going to be able to be enough. And so I'm going to try my best, but just open your heart to the Holy Spirit. Open your heart to what God wants to communicate to you, because his kindness is beyond our imagination. In fact, it doesn't even make sense. Scandalous. His kindness is so great. And so our first takeaway is God's kindness towards you specifically, not just us as a people, because it is us as a people as well. Towards you is extravagant. And you're like, what? Interesting, maybe you hadn't thought of that before. But it's easy to miss, as our ability to receive God's love and recognize his kindness is dependent on our perception of him and his presence in our lives, but maybe more specifically, like how closely connected he is to our everyday life. And so when we're feeling distant from God, doesn't mean we actually are, but those feelings are real. It's really difficult. It's hard to recognize God's kindness in our lives. So we can start macro. We'll go let's go out. God giving us life, the very air that we breathe, his provision, his protection, his salvation, the giving of Jesus, his son, his one and only son, that we might be saved so that he could start this family, begin this family through Jesus. So those are the big themes, and we hear those all the time. But I think, and I'm included, I think we take this for granted so much. Because if you've been to church a lot, if you haven't, you'd be like, wow, no, this is all new, this is awesome. But if you've heard a lot of sermons, you've heard it a lot. If you've celebrated a lot of Easters, you've heard it a lot. And I think we kind of forget the significance of what God has done for us on our behalf, and that it is the ultimate display of his generosity and kindness, his steadfast love. But not just to the world and to everyone else, but to you. So we start out here, but funneling in, like, how involved do you think God is in your everyday life? In the relationships that you have? In the coincidences that happen throughout the day? Have you ever had that question? I still have this question. I'm going to preach on it. I'll still be asking this question. How involved is God? How close is he to my everyday life? Well, one of the things we see is Naomi is blinded by her bitterness. So she's bitter. She can't see God's kindness. That's very clear in chapter 1. Can't see his kindness, can't see his blessing. But in chapter 2, a new perspective is birthed, I guess you could say. And we're going to pick this up a little bit later, but I wanted to say this one thing. I think doubting God's kindness and steadfast love for us is literally, and I don't use that as Gen Z does. It's literally, and then whatever they're going to say, it's not literally. Sorry, all the Gen Z, what? Or maybe you're like, am I Gen Z? Okay, enough of that. Steadfast love is the oldest trick in the book. Why? Because it's the trick that happened in the garden with Adam and Eve. The enemy cast doubt about God's steadfast love and his kindness. He's holding out on you. He doesn't want you to be like him. And so doubting God's kindness, this inability to see it, this has been happening for thousands of years. And we all have to face it, and we all have to get through it. And I think the story of Ruth gives us the pathway for that. If you're unable to see the blessing and the kindness that God has bestowed on you because you're in difficult circumstances, read the book of Ruth. God's at work. I know it doesn't feel like it. I mean, I'm in this. It's hard. And it's easy to doubt his kindness, especially when it comes to me personally. Really? Because this doesn't feel kind. Right? This doesn't feel loving. I don't feel loved. But it's the oldest trick in the book. So how do we recognize God's kindness? Like, how do we see it better? First of all, I think, which is our next takeaway, is we have to understand that God sees you. You are not forgotten by God. Again, you might feel like you're forgotten. You might feel like you're abandoned. That's part of the human experience, it's part of the Christian experience. Like, there are times when that happens. But he knows what you're going through. He knows your joy and your pain. He knows your doubts and your beliefs. He knows your despair and your hope. He knows it all. You are not unnoticed. Ruth, who should have been unnoticed in every way, because she fit all of the categories of the unnoticed person. She's noticed. She can't escape God's kindness. So understanding that God sees you and accepting that leads us to the next takeaway. It's God's loving hand is with you. God is involved in your life. Ruth reminds us that God is present and active in our day-to-day activities, relationships, and interactions. He's there through it all. So I think so this may be a little bit more for me, but in my kind of modern day mentality of seeing life, I think that my perception is usually based on chance. I'm not necessarily going like, okay, God, what's going on right now? Like, why did that guy cut me off? Is there something? Right? It seems a little weird, but I think mostly I'm just going free will and chance, and that's it. But that's a good recipe for not ever recognizing God's kindness, which doesn't bode well for me, right? Because I'm like, what? So how do I change this? So I think it's actually simple, yet incredibly difficult, but it begins by being more aware, intentionally being more aware of God's presence in your life. It's called practicing the presence. And it's this idea of learning to live in the awareness of his presence for your life a little bit more each day. So then it helps us to see God's hidden work, the stuff that we can't see, and his loving hand in our lives. So becoming more aware of God's presence in your life makes you more aware of the things that he is doing. Which in turn, what does that do? Well, you start seeing his kindness, not just to you, but sometimes to other people. You start seeing his generosity. You start seeing his love. I think we may not stop wrestling with abandonment, but it definitely gets less. And so on the flip side of what else starts to happen? Well, I think we start ascribing the circumstances, encounters, all the different details in our lives. I think we stop just ascribing them to chance. I think that starts to change. Because I don't know where the line is between kind of, I don't want to go like way over on the other side, and where I don't even know what the ditch that is, right? I have to define that. I know this ditch, though. I'm very familiar with it, where everything is just chance and free will. Because then, sure, we could admit God exists or think about it even, but it doesn't really affect the way we live. And so I think as we become more aware of his presence personally in our lives, that less and less happens just by chance. Secondly, I think we become able to recognize and celebrate God's kindness to us specifically. Right? So it's not just an awareness. We're actually enabled to celebrate that kindness that God shows us. And finally, we see this in the text, that hope grows as our perspective shifts to one of gratitude. We see it in Naomi's response. It's a complete shift from chapter 1. In fact, even in the opening of chapter 2, now we have a different Naomi who's suddenly recognizing God's kindness through the man Boaz. And so you see this switch. in her perspective. It's just beginning, and it's going to get more as we travel through this story. Last takeaway is hope and redemption. God's promise of redemption can bring hope in any circumstance that we find ourselves in. See, as we're becoming more and more aware of his presence, we're seeing his work in our lives and in the lives of others. We're starting to recognize it, celebrate it. This hope is beginning to build in us. Our attitude becomes one of gratitude. We start to see that redemption has unbelievable potential and power. This is who God is. God is the Redeemer. That's who he is. This is part of who he is. This is what he does. It comes out of his character, his love, his kindness, all of these things about God. It comes out of him, his desire for us to be with him, his love for us. And in this redemption, we find it in the life of Jesus. There is, you know how much power there is? Resurrection power. God can bring anything in your life that you think is dead to life. Anything. If he can bring a man from death to life, God can bring anything. He can breathe life into anything. There's no situation, no relationship, no hardship, no nothing that's too far gone or too great that God can't redeem it. This is the idea of redemption. This is why there's so much hope built into redemption. That God can redeem any situation. And so where do we put our hope? We put it in God. We put our hope, that's where we place our hope. Put it in Jesus because this is who he is. And so if there's a situation, relationship, hardship that you've been feeling is too far gone, it's too great, it's beyond redemption. I'm going to pray.